Mafia boss caught his secretary crying in closet. What he did next changed everything. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Clara had always been the quiet one in the office. At 26, she was already the right hand to one of the city's most powerful figures, Marco Danelli, a mafia boss who ran a legitimate business empire on the surface but had his hand in everything from politics to underground dealings. Clara, a secretary, was organized, efficient, and professional. She handled Marco's schedule, answered his calls, and knew more about his world than most people could ever imagine. But behind her perfect smile and poised appearance, Clara was hiding something. She had spent months juggling the pressures of her job, her personal life, and the dark secret that haunted her every day. It wasn't long before the stress of it all started to weigh heavily on her. That afternoon, with the office emptying out and only a few late workers left, Clara found herself alone in the back room of the office building, curled up in the corner of the storage closet. Her face was buried in her hands as silent sobs racked her body. She had been doing her best to stay strong, to keep up the facade of the competent, composed secretary Marco trusted, but it was all too much. The toxic relationship she was in with her boyfriend, the constant pressure of her work, and the fear that one day Marco might find out the truth about her personal struggles. It was all becoming too overwhelming. But what Clara didn't know was that Marco was closer than she thought. He had been in the office longer than usual, handling some final meetings for the day. When he finished up, he walked through the hall, heading toward his office. His sharp eyes noticed the faint sound of a soft sob coming from the back room. He paused, listening closely. His first instinct was to ignore it. After all, Clara was his secretary, not someone he needed to worry about on a personal level. But something about the sound, so raw, so vulnerable, pulled at him. He turned, stepping quietly down the hallway toward the back room. He stood at the door for a moment, watching as Clara sat there, her shoulders shaking with each silent sob. The usual composed secretary was now just a woman, broken and lost in her own private pain. Marco didn't say anything at first. He wasn't the type to show sympathy, especially not to someone who worked for him. But this was different. Clara wasn't just a secretary in that moment. She was a person, vulnerable and alone. Without saying a word, Marco stepped inside. Clara didn't hear him at first, too consumed by her own thoughts. But when she finally looked up, she froze, her eyes meeting his piercing gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, no demand for answers. There was just a quiet understanding. Marco didn't need to speak to make his presence known. He simply walked toward her, his movements calm and measured. "Clara," he said quietly, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "You're not alone in this." Clara's heart raced. She had never expected Marco to find her like this, much less offer comfort. It wasn't like him. He was cold, distant, a mafia boss who ruled his empire with an iron fist. Yet, in that moment, he seemed different. Clara wiped her tears, trying to regain some semblance of control, but Marco reached out and gently lifted her chin with his hand, urging her to meet his eyes. "You don't need to hide your pain from me," he said, his tone low and commanding, but with a hint of something unexpected, genuine care. Clara's mind raced. Was this real? Was Marco Danelli, the man who had built his empire on fear and intimidation, really showing her compassion? Or was this just another manipulation, a way to keep her under his control? She couldn't tell. But one thing was certain. In that moment, everything was about to change. The silence in the office felt heavy, almost suffocating. Clara sat there, her body still trembling from the outburst she had just had, her hands still wiping the last remnants of her tears away. Marco stood in front of her, his presence commanding, yet somehow softer than she had ever experienced it before. He wasn't the cold, ruthless mafia boss who ruled with an iron fist. In this moment, he was something else, something unexpected. "You don't need to hide your pain from me," Marco had said. His words lingered in the air, as Clara struggled to comprehend what was happening. For a brief second, the world outside that closet didn't matter. She didn't care about the secrets, the lies, or the dangerous underworld Marco controlled. In that moment, all she cared about was what this meant for her. Marco stepped back slightly, giving her some space, but not completely walking away. There was something in his eyes, a kind of curiosity mixed with genuine concern, that unsettled her. You don't need to keep everything inside, Marco continued, his voice almost a whisper now. I've seen pain before, but I've also seen how to make it go away. Clara looked up at him, her heart racing. Was this his way of trying to manipulate her? Was this just another tactic, a way for him to gain more control over her? She had seen it before, how he could read people, how he knew just what to say to get under their skin, to make them think they needed him. But this was different. The look in his eyes wasn't one of control. It was one of empathy. Clara stood up, her legs unsteady, as though the weight of the world had just been lifted from her shoulders. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to process what had just happened. I don't know what to do anymore, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to Marco or to herself. I've tried to keep it all together, but it's hard. I can't do it on my own. Marco didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply nodded as if he understood exactly what she meant. For a moment, they just stood there, the space between them charged with an unspoken understanding. Marco's voice broke the silence. You don't have to do it alone, he said quietly. I can help, in ways you don't even realize. Clara swallowed hard, her mind racing. I don't want your help, she said quickly, almost defensively. I don't want to be another one of your projects. Marco didn't flinch. His gaze never wavered. This isn't about control, Clara, he said, his voice steady but firm. This is about what's right. You've been carrying a burden that isn't yours to carry. Let me help you, not because I want to control you, but because I want you to be free of this. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. How could he be so sure of himself? So confident that he could help her? She had lived her entire life in a world where people helped each other for the wrong reasons. They helped because they wanted something in return. But Marco wasn't like anyone else she had ever known. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice trembling. What do you want from me? Marco took a slow breath, his expression unreadable. I'm not asking for anything, Clara, he said, stepping closer again, this time with more purpose. I'm offering you a chance to take back control of your life. To stop hiding, stop running. You've been strong for so long. Now, let me be strong for you. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Was this really happening? Was Marco Danelli, the Mafia boss who controlled everything from the shadows, offering her a chance to be free of her pain? I can't, she whispered, shaking her head. I can't trust you. Marco's gaze softened, and for the first time, Clara saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. I don't expect you to trust me, Clara, he said gently. But I am here, and I'm not going anywhere. The air around them grew thick with tension, but it wasn't the kind of tension that came from fear or anger. It was the kind of tension that came from an unspoken promise, a pact that neither of them could yet fully understand. Clara took a deep breath, her hands still shaking, but with a new sense of determination. She had spent so long trying to control everything, trying to fix everything on her own. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go. Maybe it was time to stop being strong all the time. As Marco stepped closer, she didn't back away. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that someone might actually be there to help her. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt a glimmer of hope. Clara sat in the stillness of the office, her breath shaky and uneven. Marco's words lingered in her mind, echoing in the empty space around them. You don't have to do it alone. I can help, in ways you don't even realize. She had been so sure of her own strength, of her ability to carry the weight of her burdens. But here, in the presence of this man, something shifted. She didn't know if she was ready to trust him, but the promise of his offer was undeniable. You don't have to carry it alone, Marco's voice had said with quiet resolve. Clara closed her eyes, fighting the growing storm of emotions inside her. She had lived for years, trying to hide her vulnerability, putting on the mask of a strong, independent woman. But now, standing here with Marco, she wondered if it was time to take the mask off. It felt like she was standing at the edge of something that could either save her or destroy her. But the thought of continuing on the same path, with the same pain, was far worse than taking the leap into the unknown. Marco, seeing the inner turmoil on Clara's face, took a step closer. He didn't speak right away, he just waited. He wasn't trying to rush her into anything. He understood the weight of her hesitation. He understood that trust wasn't something to be demanded, it had to be earned. Clara, feeling the warmth of his presence, met his gaze once again. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable in her life. But there was a strange comfort in knowing that, for the first time, she didn't have to face everything alone. "I don't know if I can trust you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marco's eyes softened, and for the first time, Clara saw a glimpse of the man behind the Mafia boss. He wasn't just the ruthless leader of a criminal empire. In this moment, he was simply a man offering her a lifeline. "You don't have to trust me right now," Marco replied, his voice low but steady. "But you do have to trust that I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to leave you to fight this battle alone." Clara swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. She didn't know what this would mean, what would happen next, but she knew one thing. This moment was pivotal. She had a choice to make. The walls she had built around herself, the walls that had kept her safe, were beginning to crumble. And yet, for the first time, she didn't feel as though she was losing control. She felt as though she was gaining it. Marco stepped back, giving her space, but his presence was still felt. "I'll be here when you're ready to talk, Clara," he said. "But you don't have to do this alone anymore." He turned and walked toward the door, but just as he reached the handle, he stopped. Without turning around, he added, "You're stronger than you think. Don't let anyone, including yourself, tell you otherwise." Clara sat in the stillness, her thoughts swirling. Was this really happening? Was Marco Danelli, the feared Mafia boss, offering her something more than just protection? Was he offering her a chance at something better? The weight of his words pressed down on her chest, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to breathe. It wasn't just the physical act of breathing, but the emotional release she had been holding in for so long. She felt the tension in her body start to loosen, just a little, and the knot in her stomach begin to unravel. As the minutes passed, Clara finally stood up, her legs unsteady but determined. She looked around the office, the same office that had once felt like a cage, but now seemed like a place of possibility. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew that this was a turning point. She had a choice: to face her fears head-on, or to continue living in the shadows of her own pain. She walked to the door, her hand resting on the handle, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel trapped. She wasn't sure what would come next, but one thing was certain: she was no longer going to face it alone. The following days after Marco's offer were strangely calm, but Clara's mind raced. She was no longer the woman who hid behind the facade of a competent secretary. Marco's words had cut through the layers of her defenses, leaving her exposed in ways she hadn't anticipated. She felt like a weight was lifting off her shoulders, but at the same time, the uncertainty of her next steps was unsettling. She hadn't agreed to Marco's offer, not fully, but the promise he made lingered. He wasn't the cold and calculating man she had known for so long. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of something else, a person who might genuinely care about her well-being, not as a tool in his empire, but as a human being. Clara walked through the office each day, her movements slower, more deliberate. She was still the secretary, the one who answered the calls, organized the papers, and managed Marco's chaotic schedule. But something had shifted. The work felt different. She had become acutely aware of her own worth, of her own place in this world she had long ignored. That night, after work, Clara sat alone in her apartment, staring at the blank walls. The quiet seemed deafening. Her phone buzzed, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a message from Marco. "I'll be at the office late tomorrow. Don't work too hard. Let me know if you need anything." She stared at the message for a while before typing back a simple, "Thank you." She didn't expect anything more. Marco had made it clear that he was there for her, but that didn't mean she could lean on him completely. Not yet. The following evening, she entered the office building later than usual. The city's lights outside were dim, casting long shadows in the hallway. As she passed Marco's office, she caught a glimpse of him through the glass. His sharp suit was still impeccably tailored, but his expression was distant, almost brooding. He didn't look up when she entered. Clara took a deep breath and walked toward his desk, trying to shake off the unease creeping up her spine. She cleared her throat, and Marco finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers with that familiar intensity. "You're here late," he remarked, his voice even, but she could hear the underlying concern. "I'm fine. Clara responded, though she wasn't entirely sure of that herself. There was something about Marco's presence that both comforted and unsettled her. He was a man of contradictions, powerful yet surprisingly gentle, cold yet at times warm. Marco gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Clara hesitated, then sat down. She didn't know what he expected from her, but she was about to find out. Marco studied her for a moment before speaking again. "I meant what I said the other day. You're not alone in this. You don't have to keep pretending everything's fine." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't realized just how much she had been pretending until now. "I know," she whispered, her voice faltering. "But I don't know what to do with all of this. It feels too much." Marco leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't have to have all the answers right now, Clara," he said, his voice softer now. "But you should know that you're allowed to feel. And you're allowed to take a step back, to not be strong all the time." His words were a revelation. Clara had spent so long in survival mode that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply be. To feel vulnerable without fear of being judged, to trust someone enough to show weakness. Marco's presence, his willingness to listen, was like a lifeline. It was everything Clara hadn't realized she needed. And yet, even as she felt that strange sense of comfort, the reality of who Marco was, the man who controlled vast parts of the city, reminded her that she could never fully let her guard down. He wasn't just a man offering help. He was the Mafia boss who could crush anyone who got in his way. Clara took a deep breath, her mind racing. "What if I can't trust you? What if this is just another way for you to control me?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear and uncertainty. Marco's expression didn't change. "You don't have to trust me now, Clara," he replied. "But trust that I will never force you into anything. If you decide to walk away from this, I will let you." His words were simple, but Clara could sense the weight behind them. It wasn't just a promise of protection, it was an offer of freedom, of autonomy. Clara wasn't used to being given that choice, especially not from someone like Marco. He was the kind of man who took control, not the kind who handed it over willingly. And yet, here he was, offering her something she had never expected. A choice. As the silence stretched between them, Clara realized something. She had been fighting for so long, trying to keep herself together, trying to survive in a world that seemed to want to break her. But now, Marco was offering her a way out. A way to be free of the weight she had carried alone for so long. And for the first time, Clara wondered if it was time to stop fighting. Maybe it was time to trust, at least just enough to let someone in. Clara sat at the edge of the desk, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of a paper. She had heard Marco's words over and over in her head, trying to decide what to do next. The warmth of his offer was still fresh in her mind, but the weight of her own doubts pressed heavily on her chest. Trust. Could she trust him? And more importantly, could she trust herself to take the next step? Marco had made it clear that he wasn't forcing her into anything. His offer wasn't about control, it was about freedom. Freedom from her pain, from the burden of carrying everything alone. But even as she thought about it, a small voice in her head told her to be careful. Marco Danelli wasn't just any man. He wasn't a colleague or a friend. He was a mafia boss, someone who ruled over everything in the shadows. What if he had his own agenda? What if his kindness had a price? Clara looked out the window, the city lights shining like tiny stars in the distance. The night had fallen quickly, and the office building was almost silent now. Marco's office was dimly lit, the only light coming from the desk lamp. It was late, too late to still be thinking about what had happened that day, but Clara couldn't help it. She needed to make a decision. As she stood up to stretch her legs, Marco entered the office. His steps were quiet, but Clara could feel the air change as soon as he walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching her, his gaze intense and calculating. He had always been like that, always aware, always watching. But tonight, there was something different in his eyes. It wasn't the usual cold detachment. This time, his expression was softer, more vulnerable, if that was even possible for someone like him. "Still thinking?" Marco asked, his voice low and calm, yet there was an underlying urgency there. Clara met his gaze, not sure how to respond. She had so many questions, so many things she still didn't understand. But the one thing she did understand was that she couldn't keep living in the shadow of fear, of pain. "I'm not sure what to do," Clara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I've spent so long pretending to be fine, pretending I'm strong enough to handle everything. But I don't feel strong anymore. I feel lost. Marco took a step closer, his presence filling the space between them. You don't have to be strong all the time, he said quietly, his voice almost gentle. You don't have to pretend to be something you're not. We all have our weaknesses, Clara, and it's okay to show them. Clara looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something in his words, something she hadn't expected to hear from him. Marco Danelli, the man who ran everything with power and authority, was telling her it was okay to be weak. It was okay to ask for help. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt the weight of her own vulnerability, but it didn't feel as terrifying as it once had. But what if I can't handle it? Clara asked, her voice cracking slightly. What if I let you down? What if I'm not enough? Marco's expression softened. You won't let me down, he said, his voice firm but reassuring. And you are enough, Clara. You always have been. You just need to believe that. Clara felt her throat tighten as emotions she had long buried began to surface. For so long, she had tried to keep everything together, tried to be perfect, tried to make sure no one saw her weaknesses. But now, standing in front of Marco, she realized that it wasn't about perfection. It was about accepting herself, flaws and all. I don't know if I'm ready to trust you fully, Clara whispered, the words heavy with doubt. Marco reached out, his hand brushing gently against hers. You don't have to trust me fully right now, he said. Trust takes time. But trust that I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not asking for anything in return. I just want to help you. Clara's heart raced as she looked at him, her mind still swirling with doubt, but something inside her stirred. For the first time in years, she felt like she was standing at the edge of something new, something that could change everything. It wasn't going to be easy, and there was no guarantee of what would happen next. But Clara knew one thing. She couldn't keep running from herself. She had to face her fears, face her past, and maybe, just maybe, let Marco in. Slowly, she nodded. Okay, she said, her voice quiet but resolute. I'll trust you. Just don't make me regret it. Marco's lips curved into a small, reassuring smile. You won't regret it, Clara. I promise. The words, though simple, carried a weight of sincerity that Clara couldn't ignore. As Marco left the room, Clara felt something shift within her. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to walk it. She wasn't alone anymore. Clara woke the next morning with a heaviness in her chest, but for the first time in months, it was not the kind of heaviness that crushed her. It was different. It was the weight of a decision she knew would shape everything that came next. She had told Marco she would trust him. The words had left her lips before she could pull them back, but even now, lying on her small bed with the faint hum of the city outside her window, she did not regret it. Trust was a fragile thing. It had been broken for her more times than she could count. But last night, when Marco had spoken with that quiet conviction, when his eyes had softened in a way she had never seen before, she felt something unfamiliar. Hope. A soft knock sounded on her apartment door. Clara froze. Hardly anyone visited her without warning, and no one knew where she lived except a few coworkers and her boyfriend. Her heart tightened as she stepped toward the door, but when she looked through the peephole, her breath caught. It was Marco. He stood in the dim hallway, dressed in a dark coat, his expression unreadable but calm. Not angry, not demanding, just present. Clara opened the door slowly. Marco, what are you doing here? Her voice was shaky, not from fear exactly, but from the shock of seeing him in the one place she never expected him to be. You left your phone at the office, he said simply, lifting the device in his hand, and I thought you might need it. He took a breath, his gaze sweeping her face with an intensity that made her pulse skip. But that's not the only reason I'm here. Clara felt her stomach twist. She stepped aside, letting him enter her small apartment. It felt impossibly small with him inside, his tall frame taking up the limited space like he owned it. Marco looked around briefly, absorbing everything, but without judgment. His eyes settled on her again. You trusted me last night, Marco began, his voice steady. But trust does not grow in silence. You need to tell me what has been hurting you. Clara stiffened. She had expected this moment, but not so soon, not at her apartment, not when she was still raw from yesterday. Marco, I do not know if I can talk about it yet. She wrapped her arms around herself as though holding herself together. He stepped closer, not touching her, but near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "You do not have to give me every detail," he said. "But you cannot heal what you refuse to face." Clara felt the truth of his words press against her like a tide. The secret she carried, the pain she hid, the fear she lived with, it all sat in her throat like a stone. And suddenly, without warning, tears began to spill down her cheeks. She was tired. Tired of running. Tired of hiding. Tired of pretending. Marco's expression shifted, the hardness slipping away as he reached out, slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wished. When she did not, his hand cupped her cheek, wiping her tears with his thumb. "Tell me who hurt you," he said quietly. The words were not a demand, not a threat. They were a vow, a promise of protection. Clara inhaled shakily. "It is my boyfriend," she confessed in a trembling voice. The first time she had ever said it out loud. "He gets angry, and it is my job to stay calm. He says it is my fault when things go wrong. He says I make him do things he does not want to do. And I believed him for a long time." Marco's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening with a dangerous intensity. "Has he hurt you physically?" The question lingered between them like a blade. Clara hesitated, her breath faltering. She lifted the sleeve of her sweater slightly, revealing a faint yellowing bruise near her elbow. Marco's breath stilled. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was loaded, heavy, violent in its stillness. "He put his hands on you," Marco said, each word measured, controlled, but burning with fury underneath. "Clara, look at me." She did. Slowly. Fear flickered in her chest, not of Marco, but of the storm she could see forming behind his eyes. A storm that was not aimed at her. A storm that was entirely for her. "No one," Marco said softly, yet with the authority of a man who could move an entire city with a single order. "No one hurts what is mine to protect." Clara's breath caught. Her heart pounded. She wanted to pull away, to reject the possessiveness in his words. But the truth was, for the first time, she felt safe. Truly safe. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "What are you going to do, Marco?" He stepped closer until his forehead nearly touched hers, his voice dropping into a low promise. "I am going to make sure he never hurts you again." And in that moment, Clara knew everything was about to change. Clara couldn't breathe as Marco's words echoed in her mind. "I am going to make sure he never hurts you again." The weight of his promise hung heavy in the air between them. She had never felt so vulnerable, yet there was something comforting in his resolve. Marco was not the kind of man to make empty promises. He was the Mafia boss who controlled everything. But for her, he was offering something she hadn't dared to hope for: protection. Marco looked at Clara, his expression unreadable, but there was a fire in his eyes that made her heart race. For the first time, she could feel the depth of his power, not in the way he controlled his empire, but in the way he protected what mattered to him. "Are you sure about this?" Clara asked, her voice shaking with uncertainty. She had lived most of her life in fear, trying to protect herself from the chaos that always seemed to follow her. Could she really trust Marco to shield her from everything that had threatened her? Marco stepped closer, his presence consuming the space between them. "Clara," he said softly, his voice calm but filled with a quiet strength. "I've been in the business of protection for a long time, and I know exactly what needs to be done to make sure you're safe. You don't have to worry about him anymore. I'll take care of it." Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. There was a finality in his tone, a certainty that sent a wave of relief washing over her. But it was also terrifying. The idea of Marco taking control of her life in ways she couldn't even fully understand was overwhelming. "I don't want him to hurt anyone else," Clara whispered, the guilt she had carried for so long creeping into her voice. "I don't want to be the reason anyone else gets hurt." Marco's eyes softened as he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You are not the one to blame here, Clara. No one deserves to be treated the way he's treated you. You have nothing to feel guilty about, and I will make sure he never hurts anyone again. That's a promise." His words, though firm, were filled with something unexpected: compassion. Marco was not just offering her safety, he was offering her a chance to heal. Clara's heart pounded as she looked up at him, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She had always been the one to take care of herself, the one who carried the weight of her problems alone. But now, with Marco standing before her, offering her protection, something inside her began to shift. She was no longer alone. She no longer had to carry the burden by herself. "Thank you," Clara said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a simple expression of gratitude, but it meant more than words could convey. Marco gave her a small nod, his gaze steady. "I'm here, Clara. I'll always be here." The sincerity in his words made her feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. It was terrifying, but it was also freeing. She had spent so much of her life running, hiding, pretending to be someone she wasn't. But now, in the presence of Marco, she realized she didn't have to do that anymore. She didn't have to keep pretending. As the days passed, Marco kept his word. He didn't make any grand gestures, but his actions spoke volumes. He made sure her ex-boyfriend stayed out of her life for good, using his connections to ensure there were no more threats, no more fear. And with each passing day, Clara felt the weight of her past begin to lift. Marco gave her the space she needed to heal, but he was always there, ready to step in if she needed him. Slowly, Clara began to trust him more. Not just as the powerful Mafia boss who had saved her, but as the man who genuinely cared about her well-being. There were moments when they would talk, and Marco would listen, offering advice or simply being a quiet presence as Clara poured out her thoughts. She didn't need to hide anymore. One night, as Clara sat in Marco's office, she felt a warmth that had been absent from her life for so long. Marco had offered her protection, but he had also offered her something deeper, acceptance. He didn't see her as weak. He saw her as someone who had been through hell and survived. "You're stronger than you think," Marco said, his voice low but filled with conviction. Clara met his gaze, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and something else she couldn't quite name. "I don't feel strong," she admitted, "but I'm starting to believe that I can be." Marco's lips curved into a faint smile. "You've always been strong, Clara. You just needed someone to remind you of that." Clara's chest tightened as the truth of his words sank in. She had always been strong, but she had forgotten that part of herself. Now, with Marco by her side, she was beginning to remember. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally in control of her life, not because of her own strength, but because she had allowed someone else to share that strength with her. It was a terrifying but beautiful thing, to trust someone, to let them in. But Clara knew, deep down, that she was ready for it. She wasn't alone anymore. And neither was Marco. Clara had never felt a day pass so slowly in her life. The promise Marco had made still echoed in her mind. "I will make sure he never hurts you again." But as the days went by, the reality of those words started to weigh on her. Marco was keeping his distance, and in the moments when she was alone, the overwhelming sense of uncertainty crept back in. Was she truly safe? Could she really let go of the constant fear she had lived with for so long? Clara sat at her desk, staring at the screen in front of her, but not seeing it. Her mind wandered back to the conversations she had with Marco. She had trusted him, but how much? Was she just one of his many responsibilities? A small part of his empire to protect? Or did she mean something more to him? She thought about his eyes, the way he looked at her with such quiet intensity, and how he had promised to keep her safe. But she wasn't sure if she could ever stop being scared, stop being unsure of everything. Marco's business wasn't just a business. It was a world full of danger, betrayal, and violence. Clara had seen bits and pieces of it, the cold dealings, the power struggles. She wasn't naive. She knew the kind of man Marco was, even if she had seen a different side of him in the past few weeks. That man, the one who promised her safety, was still the one who ruled the streets. He was a man of violence, not one to shy away from getting what he wanted. And while she had started to trust him, that trust came with a nagging fear that she couldn't shake. That evening, after a long day at the office, Clara found herself standing in front of Marco's office door. She had decided. She had to confront him, to ask him the questions that were eating away at her. She knocked softly, the sound almost swallowed by the vast emptiness of the building. Marco's voice, deep and steady, called from inside. "Come in." Clara hesitated for a moment before she opened the door. Marco was sitting at his desk, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows on his sharp features. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Clara," he said, his voice neutral. "What's on your mind?" Clara walked slowly toward him, her heart beating a little faster. She had been rehearsing what to say, but now that she was here, the words didn't come as easily as she thought they would. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Marco, I need to understand something, she began, her voice quiet but firm. You said you'd protect me, that you'd make sure no one hurts me again. But I need to know if you really mean it. Marco's expression remained unchanged, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that made her heart race. What are you asking, Clara? He replied, his voice soft yet filled with an unspoken challenge. Clara stepped closer to him, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. I need to know that I'm not just another thing you're taking care of because it's part of your empire. I need to know that you want to protect me, not because you feel obligated, but because you actually care. The silence between them stretched. Marco didn't speak immediately, and Clara felt a wave of uncertainty wash over her. She had asked the question, but now that it was out in the open, she wasn't sure if she wanted to hear the answer. Marco leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. For a moment, he seemed to be weighing his words carefully. Then, finally, he spoke. Clara, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I don't do things for the sake of doing them. I don't make promises I don't intend to keep. When I said I would protect you, I meant it. But I also meant something else. He paused, and Clara's heart skipped a beat. What else? She asked, her voice barely audible. Marco's gaze softened, and for the first time, she saw a vulnerability in him that she hadn't noticed before. I care about you, Clara, he said simply, the words cutting through the tension like a knife. Not because I'm your boss, not because I need you, but because you matter to me. I want to make sure you're safe, because you're important to me. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected those words. They hit her harder than she anticipated, and for a moment, she felt her world shift. Marco had always been a man of action, a man who didn't show his emotions, but in that moment, the weight of his words hung between them like a silent vow. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. But something inside her stirred. She had wanted to believe that Marco cared, but hearing him say it out loud was a different kind of truth. I don't know what to do with this, Clara whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. Marco stood up from his desk, his eyes never leaving hers. He closed the distance between them, standing so close now that Clara could feel the warmth of his body. You don't have to do anything, he said softly. You just have to trust me. Trust that I will never let anyone hurt you again. Clara's heart raced as she looked into his eyes. She could see the sincerity there, the promise he had made to her. She had been afraid to let go of her fear, afraid of what trusting Marco would mean. But now, in this moment, she realized something. Trust didn't have to mean weakness. It didn't have to mean losing herself. It meant giving herself the chance to heal, to be free of the chains that had bound her for so long. I will trust you, Clara said, her voice steady, her heart finally at peace. And in that moment, she knew, without a doubt, that everything had changed. Marco had kept his promise. And now, it was time for her to take the next step, to trust him fully. She wasn't alone anymore. Clara walked out of Marco's office that night with her heart pounding, her mind spinning, and her entire world shifting beneath her feet. She had heard him say the words she never thought he would say. You matter to me. No one had said that to her in years. Maybe no one had truly meant it at all. But Marco did. She felt it in the way he looked at her, in the quiet promise behind his voice. Yet even as the warmth of his confession wrapped around her, a cold whisper of doubt slid beneath her skin. Caring came with consequences in Marco's world. And consequences in his world were never small. The following morning, the office felt different. Clara moved through the hallways more aware of her surroundings, more aware of herself. She could feel the eyes of the other employees on her, subtle glances that told her they sensed something had changed. They could not possibly know what had happened, but they felt the shift in energy between her and Marco. Marco entered the office shortly after she arrived, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his expression unreadable but unmistakably focused. He walked past several employees who stepped aside without hesitation. When his gaze landed on Clara, it softened for a split second, a tiny flicker that only she would notice. But Clara looked away quickly, her heart racing. Trusting him was one thing. Navigating the new tension between them was another. She needed time. She needed to breathe. Throughout the morning, Marco's meetings went one after another, and Clara found herself replaying every moment from the previous night. His voice, his closeness, his confession, the warmth in his eyes that she had never seen directed at anyone else. It made her feel safe, but also exposed. and she had not been this exposed in a long time. During his lunch break, Marco called her into his office. "Close the door," he said softly. Clara did as he asked and took a slow step toward his desk. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. "How are you feeling today?" he asked. It was such a simple question, but coming from him, it carried weight. Clara hesitated. She considered lying, brushing it off with a bland answer. But after everything, she owed him honesty. "Overwhelmed," she admitted quietly. "But not in a bad way." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Marco's mouth. "You were trying to make sense of things. I understand that." He paused, then added, "I do not want you to feel rushed. Whatever you feel, whatever you are processing, it is valid. You have time, Clara." She nodded, surprised by the gentleness in his tone. Marco never rushed. Marco commanded. But with her, he was patient, careful, and that frightened her more than anything. "Marco, what happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "Now," he said softly, "we take things one step at a time. You trusted me, so I will not break that trust. I will not push you into anything you are not ready for." His words should have reassured her. Instead, they stirred something deeper, something she had buried for a long time, hope mixed with fear. "I do not want to be a weakness for you," Clara whispered. Marco's eyes sharpened instantly. "You are not a weakness," he said firmly. "You are something I choose to protect. That is not the same thing." His certainty made her knees feel weak. Marco stood and walked around the desk, stopping in front of her. He did not touch her, but his presence wrapped around her like a protective shield. "Clara," he said quietly, "tell me what is worrying you." She met his gaze, her voice soft but honest. "I do not want to be dependent on you. I do not want to lose myself in all of this." Marco breathed in slowly. "You will not lose yourself. I will not let that happen. You are strong. You have always taken care of yourself. I just want to stand beside you while you learn that you do not have to carry everything alone." His words hit her hard, not because they were demanding, but because they were freeing. For so long she had believed she had to be both the shield and the sword. Now, for the first time, someone was offering her armor. "I want to trust you," Clara whispered. "Then trust me," Marco replied, his voice low and full of promise. "One step at a time." Clara inhaled shakily, and then something inside her finally loosened. She nodded. "Okay." A soft relief washed across Marco's expression. It was subtle, but she saw it, felt it. In that moment, Clara realized something she had not dared to admit before. It was not just that Marco cared about her. It was that she cared about him too, more than she should, more than she ever expected to. And as she stood there, staring into the eyes of the man who held the power to change everything, she knew her life would never be the same again. The days that followed felt surreal to Clara. She had trusted Marco with a promise that had changed everything. Slowly but surely, she was beginning to accept what that promise meant. She wasn't alone anymore. Marco had proven that to her, not just with his words, but with his actions. Every time she doubted herself, he was there, offering steady reassurance. Every time the world felt too overwhelming, he was the anchor that kept her grounded. And yet, despite his unwavering support, there was still a nagging voice in her head. She couldn't ignore the world Marco came from. The Mafia, the underworld, a world that ran on power, fear, and control. Could she ever truly belong in it? Could she be a part of his world without losing herself? As the week wore on, the tension in Clara's mind only grew. One night, after finishing her work, Clara sat in Marco's office once again. She had come to expect his presence there, his quiet strength that always seemed to fill the room. But tonight was different. She had something she needed to say. She had kept it bottled up for days, but now, she couldn't hold it in any longer. Marco was sitting behind his desk, as usual, reviewing documents with his usual air of control. But when he looked up and saw her standing there, something shifted. He stood up slowly, as if sensing that this was the moment she had been building toward. "Clara," he said, his voice low and steady. "What's on your mind?" Clara's heart pounded in her chest. The words felt heavy on her tongue. "Marco, I don't know how to do this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've trusted you. I've opened up to you, but I'm scared." Marco didn't respond right away. Instead, he moved to her side, his expression softening. He didn't ask her to explain immediately. Instead, he simply stood there, allowing her the space to say what she needed to say. I've spent so many years protecting myself, Clara continued, her voice a little stronger now. I've had to be strong, even when I was falling apart. And now, I don't know how to let go of that. I don't know how to trust fully without feeling like I'm losing myself. Marco reached out, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. You don't have to lose yourself, he said softly. Trusting me doesn't mean you give up who you are. It means that you allow yourself to let go of the burden, even if just for a moment. You've carried so much alone, Clara. Let me carry it with you. Let me help you take the weight off. Clara's breath caught in her throat as his words sank in. There was no force in his touch, no demand. Just a quiet invitation, a chance to feel safe, to feel cared for. She had never allowed herself to truly rely on anyone before. But in this moment, with Marco standing beside her, she realized something. She didn't have to face everything alone. It wasn't a weakness to ask for help. It was okay to let someone else share the load. I'm scared, Clara admitted, the words coming out in a whisper. I'm scared that if I let go, I won't be able to control it anymore. That I'll lose myself in all of this. Marco's hand slid down her arm, a reassuring touch. You're not losing yourself, Clara. You're letting yourself be seen for who you really are. You're not just a secretary. You're not just a survivor. You're Clara, and that's who I care about. The tenderness in his voice made Clara's heart ache. She had never felt so seen, so understood. She had always been the one who kept her distance, who never allowed herself to get too close to anyone, afraid that they would eventually disappoint her. But with Marco, she felt something different. She felt like maybe, just maybe, it was okay to trust. I want to believe that, she said quietly, the words filled with uncertainty. But what if I'm wrong? What if this isn't real? What if I let myself fall for you, and it all crashes down? Marco leaned closer, his breath warm against her skin. Clara, I'm not asking you to fall for me, he said gently. I'm not asking for anything from you. All I'm offering is the truth. You don't have to be afraid anymore. I'm here, and I won't let you fall. The sincerity in his words broke something inside Clara. She didn't know how to explain it, but she could feel the fear inside her slowly starting to dissolve. With Marco, for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe she could breathe without constantly looking over her shoulder. She wasn't alone, and she didn't have to fight anymore. Clara's eyes fluttered shut for a moment, and when she opened them again, she looked at Marco with a sense of clarity she had never felt before. Okay, she whispered, her voice steady. I'll let you in. I'll trust you. But I need you to understand. I'm still learning how to trust myself. Marco's eyes softened, and he smiled faintly. I understand, Clara. And you don't have to do it all at once. One step at a time. We'll do this together. The weight that had been pressing on Clara's chest for so long finally lifted. For the first time in years, she felt like she was ready to take a step forward, without fear, without the constant need to be strong. With Marco by her side, she knew that she could trust herself to let go. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt truly free. The days that followed Clara's decision to trust Marco were like a dream she hadn't dared to dream before. She woke up each morning with a sense of hope that she had never allowed herself to feel. The weight that had crushed her for so long. The fear of being alone. The pressure of keeping up appearances. The anxiety that gripped her every time she thought of her past seemed to lighten. Marco was there, as steady and constant as ever, offering her the security she had longed for without making her feel small. He gave her space to heal, but in his presence, she never felt abandoned. Slowly, Clara allowed herself to believe in the safety he had promised. However, there was still a nagging feeling in her chest, a lingering doubt that she couldn't quite shake off. She had trusted Marco with her heart, but what about his? Clara knew the kind of man he was. He was a Mafia boss, a man who had built an empire on power, fear, and manipulation. What did someone like him really want from her? Was his protection truly about her well-being, or was there another agenda at play? The question swirled in her mind, and though Marco had assured her time and time again that his feelings for her were real, Clara couldn't help but wonder. One evening, as she sat at her desk organizing files, the door to Marco's office opened. She looked up, surprised to see him standing there. He had always been a presence, but tonight, there was something different about him. He looked restless. His usual air of calm was gone, replaced by a subtle tension that Clara couldn't ignore. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. Clara, he said, his voice unusually soft. "We need to talk." Clara stood up, her heart suddenly racing. She followed him into his office, the door clicking shut behind them. Marco stood by the window, his back to her. The usual confidence in his posture was absent, replaced by a subtle unease. Clara's stomach fluttered with a mix of nervousness and curiosity. She had never seen him like this before. "What's going on, Marco?" she asked, her voice gentle but filled with concern. Marco turned to face her, his eyes darker than usual, as if there was something heavy he was about to reveal. "I've been thinking," he began, his gaze not leaving hers. "I've been thinking about everything we've talked about. And about us." Clara's pulse quickened. Was this the moment where everything she had feared would come to light? She had given him her trust, but what if that trust was about to be shattered? Marco took a step toward her, his expression serious. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm not here to control you, Clara. I never was." She opened her mouth to respond, but he held up a hand, stopping her. "I know the kind of man I am. I know what people think of me. But you're different." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Marco's eyes softened for a moment, and he stepped closer. "You've given me something I didn't know I needed. Something I never thought I would want." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. Was he saying what she thought he was saying? "I'm not asking you to change who you are," Marco continued. "I'm asking you to trust me when I say that I want to protect you. That's all. No strings attached." Clara's mind raced, trying to piece together what Marco was trying to tell her. Was this another manipulation, another tactic to control her? Or was this real? Could she truly trust him, not just as the Mafia boss who had offered her protection, but as the man who seemed to care for her in a way that went beyond power and control? Marco seemed to sense her hesitation. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said quietly. "You've spent so long building walls around yourself, protecting your heart from everyone, including me. But I need you to know that I'm not like everyone else. I don't want anything from you, Clara. I just want to keep you safe." Clara stood there, her thoughts swirling, her heart torn between the fear that still gripped her and the warmth of his words. Was it possible for Marco to feel this way about her? Was she just another part of his world, or was there something more between them? She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I don't know if I can believe that," she whispered. "I don't know if I can let myself trust again." Marco's gaze never wavered. "You don't have to trust me all at once," he said softly. "But trust me enough to let me protect you. Trust that I'm here for you, and that I'm not going anywhere." Clara felt a pang in her chest, a deep yearning for the kind of love and protection Marco was offering. But could she truly accept it? Could she allow herself to be vulnerable enough to accept the care he was offering without fearing the cost? "I don't want to be your project, Marco," Clara said quietly. "I don't want to be someone you're just trying to fix." Marco's lips curved into a small smile. "You're not a project, Clara. You're someone I care about. And that's all I'm offering." The weight of his words settled over her like a comforting blanket. For the first time, Clara realized something important. She wasn't just someone to be fixed. She wasn't just a job. She was a person Marco genuinely cared about. And for the first time in a long time, Clara allowed herself to believe that. Maybe, just maybe, she could trust him. She took a step closer to him, her heart swelling with a mixture of fear and hope. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll trust you. But only if you promise me one thing." Marco raised an eyebrow. "Anything. Don't let me go." Marco's expression softened, and for the first time, Clara saw the depth of his emotions. "I won't," he whispered. "I'll never let you go." In that moment, Clara knew, without a doubt, that everything was changing. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what the future held. Clara could hardly believe the words that had just left her mouth. "Don't let me go." It wasn't like her to be vulnerable, to let anyone in so deeply. Yet here she was, standing in front of Marco, asking him to promise something she wasn't sure she could handle herself. But in the quiet of the room, with his intense gaze never leaving hers, it felt like the only thing that mattered. Marco's eyes softened, his expression calm but resolute. The weight of her request hung between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Clara held her breath, waiting for him to respond, her heart pounding as she wondered if she had made a mistake. But Marco wasn't like anyone she had known. He wasn't quick to promise anything he couldn't deliver. And this, Clara realized, was different. This wasn't about control or manipulation. He wasn't a man who promised empty words. He had proven that in the past weeks. Marco stepped closer, his presence enveloping her. "I won't let you go, Clara," he said, his voice low and steady, yet laced with an undeniable sincerity. "You're not going to lose me. I'm not walking away from this. And I will make sure you don't have to face anything alone again." Clara's chest tightened, but this time, the feeling was one of relief, not fear. She had feared so long that opening up, trusting someone, would make her weak. She had kept her distance from everyone, even herself, thinking that was the only way to protect herself from the hurt and betrayal she had suffered. But with Marco, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. And, dare she admit, love. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust him. And she realized, for the first time, she didn't have to hide anymore. She didn't have to fight this alone. Marco reached out, his hand gently cupping her face, bringing her attention back to him. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her forehead in a gesture that was simple but spoke volumes. Clara closed her eyes at the tenderness of the moment, her breath catching in her throat. He wasn't the monster that she had feared. He wasn't the distant, cold Mafia boss who ruled with an iron fist. He was a man who cared for her, who had shown her what it meant to be truly seen and understood. "I need you to know something," Marco whispered, his breath warm against her skin. Clara opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "You've changed me, Clara. Before you, I was content to live my life in control, in isolation. But you've made me realize that there's more to life than that. I'm not the same man I was before you walked into my life." Clara's heart swelled at his words. It was a confession she hadn't expected to hear, one that pierced through the layers of doubt and fear she had built up. But it was a truth she didn't want to ignore. It made her believe, for the first time, that maybe she wasn't just part of his world, she had become part of him. Marco had let her in, and in doing so, he had given her a gift she never thought she would receive. A chance to be loved, to be cared for without fear of losing herself in the process. But despite the warmth of the moment, Clara knew they weren't out of the woods yet. The reality of Marco's world still loomed over them. The danger, the violence, the power struggles. She couldn't ignore the weight of it all. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marco's expression remained steady, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made Clara feel like they were both standing on the edge of something big. "Now, we take it one step at a time," Marco said, his tone calm but unwavering. "We face what comes together. And no matter what happens, I'm not leaving you. I'll fight for you. And I'll make sure nothing and no one gets between us." The finality of his words, the promise they held, filled Clara with a sense of security she had never known. It was hard to believe, but looking at him now, with the weight of everything that had happened between them, she knew he meant it. There was no more fear of what he might do, no more worry about the life he led. All that mattered now was that he was here, and so was she. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that together, they could face anything. Clara stepped closer, closing the distance between them, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't hold back. She reached up, her hand gently resting against his chest, and she stood on tiptoe to kiss him. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, but it deepened as Marco responded, his arms wrapping around her. In that moment, everything else faded away. The fear, the doubt, the uncertainty, it all melted into the feeling of Marco's embrace. She wasn't alone anymore. They weren't alone. They had each other. And for the first time, Clara felt like she had found her place, not in a world of power and fear, but in Marco's world, where she was loved and protected. And in that moment, Clara knew that no matter what came next, she was ready. Together, they could handle whatever the world threw their way. Clara woke up the next morning with a sense of calm she had never felt before. The weight that had always burdened her shoulders seemed to lift just a little more each day. She had never been this sure of anything in her life, not even when she had made the decision to trust Marco. She had feared that trust would come with strings, with complications that would tie her to a life she didn't want to live. But the more time she spent with Marco, the more she realized that the only string between them was the strength of their bond. Marco had kept his promise. He didn't push her, didn't demand more than she was ready to give. He had been patient, understanding, and, most importantly, protective. The world he lived in, the world of power, control, and danger, was still a part of her reality, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like something she could navigate, with him by her side. As the days passed, their connection grew stronger. They spoke more openly about their lives, their pasts, and their fears. Clara had never shared so much with anyone before, and yet, with Marco, it felt natural. He never judged her, never tried to change her. He accepted her for who she was, flaws and all. And, in turn, she began to accept herself. She no longer felt the need to hide behind walls she had spent years building. One evening, as the sun set behind the tall city buildings, Marco invited Clara to join him for dinner at his private estate. She had grown accustomed to the luxury that came with being by his side, but it was moments like this, simple, quiet moments, that felt the most meaningful. They sat on the terrace, the city lights twinkling in the distance, a gentle breeze brushing against their skin. Marco reached across the table, taking her hand in his. Clara looked at him, the comfort of his touch settling her nerves. "You've changed everything for me, Clara," Marco said, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. "I've spent my life building an empire, but what I never had was something real. You've made me believe in something more than just power." Clara felt her heart swell. She had never imagined that someone like Marco, someone who had everything, money, power, control, could feel like he was missing something. But she understood it now. Everyone, no matter their position in life, needed connection. And what they had was real. It was raw and vulnerable, but it was theirs. "I don't know what the future holds," Clara said softly, her voice steady with the strength she had found in herself. "But I know that as long as we have this, whatever this is, together, I'm ready to face it." Marco smiled, the kind of smile that was rare for him. It wasn't the smile of a mafia boss who had conquered the world. It was the smile of a man who had finally found peace. "We'll face it together, Clara. And no matter what comes our way, I'll make sure we never face it alone." The promise in his words felt like a seal. There was no fear now, no doubt. Marco had shown her the depth of his care, and in turn, Clara had learned to care for herself. In that moment, the future didn't seem so uncertain. It seemed full of possibility. As the evening wore on, they talked about everything and nothing, about dreams, about the things they had yet to accomplish, and about the small, quiet moments that made life worth living. When the night finally came to a close, Marco walked her to her car, his hand still holding hers. "You know," Marco said as he paused before opening the door for her, "I used to think I had everything I needed. But then I met you, and I realized that what I needed was someone to share it with." Clara's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't just talking about his empire. He was talking about her. "And now you have me," Clara replied, her voice full of warmth and certainty. "You'll never be alone again." Marco looked down at her, his eyes soft with affection. "Thank you," he whispered. Clara smiled, her eyes shining with the same affection. "No, Marco. Thank you." With a final kiss on her forehead, Marco closed the door gently, watching as Clara drove off into the night. He stood there for a moment, the weight of everything he had built now not feeling as heavy. For the first time, it didn't feel like he was fighting the world. He had someone beside him, someone who saw him for who he truly was, not just the mafia boss he had been forced to become. And that made all the difference. Clara's life had changed forever the moment she trusted Marco. And his life had changed forever the moment he let her in. Together, they were no longer two separate worlds. They were one. And no matter what the future held, they were ready to face it together. In this gripping dark romance, Clara's life takes an unexpected turn when she finds herself in a relationship with Marco, a dangerous mafia boss who promises to protect her from her past. As Clara navigates the tension between trust and fear, she discovers that Marco is not just a man of power and control, but one who genuinely cares for her. This dark romance is filled with emotional depth as Clara opens up to Marco, letting go of the walls she's spent years building. But as their bond deepens, Clara must confront the terrifying truth of Marco's world and her place within it. Their journey through a world of danger and power is not just about survival, but about finding love in a place where trust is hard to come by. With each passing moment, Clara is faced with choices that will either bring her closer to Marco or force her to retreat back into the shadows. This dark romance is a story of vulnerability, strength, and the complexities of love, where every promise comes with a price. Will Clara trust Marco enough to let him into her world, Or will the dangers of his empire pull them apart? Experience the raw emotions and the thrilling twists of this dark romance that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love, trust, and loyalty.